I'll call the meeting to order. In light of my being remote today and Supervisor Leahy, the vice chair, being remote, I asked Kurt Gibbs if he could run the meeting unless there's an objection, because he's there in person versus us participating remotely. Is there an objection? If not, then the first item would be the pledge, and then Kurt, if you want to take over.
Sure, thank you, John. So we rise and we'll recite the pledge. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Well, thank you, everyone, and thank you, John, and thank the committee for allowing me to chair the meeting in John's absence and the vice chair's absence, attending remotely. We'll move on to item number 3, public comment. Is there anyone? No one's approached me, nor has anyone approached the clerk, so we'll move on to item number 4, approval of the minutes of the February 7th, 2024 Human Resources, Finance, and Property Committee meeting. What is your pleasure?
I guess I move to approve.
Motion by Supervisor Hart. Is there a second?
I can second. It's Supervisor Lemmer.
Supervisor Lemmer with the second. Any discussion? The minutes were included in the packet? Any discussion? Seeing none, we'll proceed to vote. All those in favor of the motion to approve the February 7th, 2024 Human Resources, Finance, and Property Committee meeting minutes signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Aye.
Opposed? Motion carried. Thank you. We'll move on to item number 5, policy issue discussion and potential committee determination, operational functions required by statute, ordinance, resolution, or policy. And we have item 6A, items to be discussed and possible action by the Human Resources, Finance, and Property Committee. Item number 1, claim disallowance. And I am not... Mike, do you want to address the claims disallowance?
Yes, Mr. Chair, can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Okay, great. This claim is from an individual who is actually making a claim regarding contact this person had with one of our circuit court judges. Because those judges are state employees and not county employees, our insurer is recommending that the claim be denied because the county has no liability for a state employee's actions, even if there was anything that was actionable regarding that. So the recommendation from our insurer is to disallow the claim and allow that claim to be presented to the state if the person wishes to do so.
Thank you for that explanation. Any discussion, any questions by the committee, or any motions?
Mr. Chair,
John,
Supervisor
please.
Robinson.
Supervisor Robinson, please.
I would move to deny the claim, consistent with the recommendation.
Motion by Supervisor Robinson to deny the claim in accordance with our recommendation from our insurer. Is there a second? Second by Supervisor Hart. Any discussion on the motion? Any discussion? Seeing none, the motion is to deny the claim consistent with the recommendation by our insurer. All those in favor of that motion signify by saying aye. Aye.
Aye. Aye.
Opposed, say no. Motion carried and is unanimous. We'll move on to item number 6A2, approval of the NACO request for LATC, Local Assistance and Tribal Consistency Funds reimbursement payment. I'll give a little bit of context to this. NACO, in its efforts to assist counties with and municipal and tribal governments with costs associated with having federal land on their municipality, or in this case, federal land in the county, has requested, and they went out specifically to address some of the concerns that some local units of government have in providing services in those municipalities when they have a large contingency of federal land. And NACO is looking to create an entity to advocate on behalf of that. And so there was a request that we provide 1% of that payment. It was I don't want to say a one-time payment, but it was a payment that was made over 2 years with a minimum payment of $50,000 per entity per year. And so in this case, Marathon County does have some federal land over in the town of Harrison, the old radar site that was operated at one time by the military. And so that still is federal property. And so Marathon County, along with 64 other counties in the state that does have federal lands, did receive a LATC payment. And LATCF payment, I should say. And in this case, Marathon County received a $50,000 payment per year to help offset the costs of providing services to those. The one restriction, the only restriction that sits on those funds is a restriction that you are not allowed to utilize those those funds for lobbying and or advocacy on behalf of the county. Now, that is the only restriction that there is. And so I open it up for discussion. This item was taken to the exec committee for their recommendation. Their recommendation was it was a one-time payment, 1% of that total contribution that or total dollar amount that we received. So that would amount to $1,000 payment that would be going back to NACO to assist them in their advocacy efforts as this goes forward. Anything, Administrator, you wanted to add? Any discussion by the committee?
Supervisor Leahy?
Supervisor Leahy, go ahead, please.
I would move to approve the NACO request for LATCF reimbursement payment.
Okay, we have a motion to approve the request for the one-time 1% payment of the LATCF payment or funds that we received. Is there a second? I'll second. Seconded by Supervisor Hart. Any further discussion? Any further discussion? Okay, seeing none, we'll proceed to vote on the motion to approve the one-time LATCF 1% payment of $1,000 to NACO. All those in favor of that motion signify by saying aye. Aye.
Aye.
Aye. Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. Thank you. We'll move on to item number 6A3, an update on divestment opportunity for divestment of county-owned property at 616 Forest Street and 405 South 8th Avenue in the city of Wausau, and review the request for proposal examples. And I will turn it over to Administrator Leonard, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So from reviewing your packet, you can see that there's not an RFP example in your packet. So I appreciate the opportunity to kind of tee this up for you. Just in terms of background, I think everyone on the committee will recall several months ago we began discussions about these two properties, kind of as to start our redevelopment efforts with regard to county-owned parcels that perhaps are no longer absolutely necessary for county operations. The first is a parking lot that is located kind of near the courthouse and had historically served as some courthouse parking for staff. And then the second parking lot is on South 8th Avenue, adjacent to, or across from, I should say, the UW Stevens Point Wausau campus that the university indicated was no longer needed for student parking. So several months ago, the discussion was at this committee, the direction I received was reach out to the city of Wausau to inquire if they were interested in those properties for redevelopment, particularly for housing, because adjacent to each of those parcels, there is currently housing, and that's the predominant use. I did that several months ago and reported back to the committee at the time that the city's thought process was that there wasn't sufficient interest at that point, and this is my characterization, so it is perhaps accurate but not precise. They really didn't have, it wasn't top of their list for priority for redevelopment, and they didn't have clear funding available to do that. So recently then, this committee provided direction to let's start with those two properties being our first foray into developing an RFP for redevelopment. The city of Wausau and the village of Weston were very helpful, and they provided some templates that they've used for redevelopment RFPs. And I began working on tailoring those RFPs for redevelopment for those two parcels. And then in the middle of last week, I was contacted by the City of Wausau Economic Development Director, Liz Brodek, and she asked if those parcels were still available and the county was still looking to redevelop those, and I informed her that it was, and that I was actually working on those RFPs when she called. And she let me know that the city has some access to funding for infill housing projects, which again was kind of the initial discussion some of the initial discussion that this committee had, and that the city of Wausau would have some funding opportunities through available ARPA dollars and also some housing infill dollars that they would like to utilize if the county was willing to transfer those properties to the city. She indicated that the city would likely pay appraised value for those properties. At that point, I reached out to Chair Robinson and kind of updated him on that situation, and wanted to bring it to this committee. We do not have an appraisal on either of those two properties right now. That said, I can certainly go out and get appraisals on those two parking lots. I think it would be relatively straightforward. They are, as I indicated, parking lots. Pretty easy to appraise, I would expect. I also do have funding in my budget for professional services that could be utilized to do that. So given that it was the committee's initial discussion to go that route of if the city was interested in paying appraised value rather than spend an inordinate amount of time continuing to draft those RFPs and bring them back for discussion, I thought it made sense to put it on the agenda and get some direction. If the direction is to continue to do those RFPs, I certainly can do that. If the direction alternatively is to go out and get appraisals on those two pieces of property and speak with the city regarding the value and see if the city's interested in drafting a proposal for the purchase of those, certainly can do that, and then I can devote some time to perhaps the next properties on the list of priority for this department, whether that be the Thomas Street, former Social Services building, RFP, or an RFP related to the River Drive buildings. So that's kind of where we are. Again, it was just middle of last week that the Economic Development Director reached out and indicated that these properties kind of rose more to the top of the priority list in light of not only the funding that I referenced, but also the fact that, again, in my understanding, some of the other properties that were higher on that priority list are not available or not readily available for acquisition by the city using those ARPA funds, which, as we all know, have essentially a limit on when they need to be allocated, and that is by the end of the year.
So with that background, any questions or comments or suggestions from the committee? I would, I guess, start out by saying, since that was originally our recommendation was to, pursue if the city was interested in purchasing those properties at fair market value, it seems logical that we pursue that, go out and get an appraisal, and see if the city is willing to pay appraised value, and then concentrate our efforts on looking at an RFP on potentially the other properties that the county is looking at redeveloping on. Any thoughts? Open it up to the committee.
Supervisor Lemmer?
Supervisor Lemmer, please go ahead.
I would like to also endorse the idea of working with an appraiser to get a number for the city. I think Wausau has just a critical need for infill housing, and this is a great opportunity for us to also explore some of those relationships that our housing resolution alluded to. So I'm all for an appraisal.
Other
Mr.
discussion?
Chair,
Go ahead. Supervisor Robinson, please.
I agree with all the comments that were made. I think this is consistent with what policy we had begun to develop as a committee, and including working with the local government in which the property is located. It also honors our commitment to trying to deal with housing. So I would support this effort. If we need a motion to direct the administrator to obtain appraisals, I would make that motion.
Okay, there's a motion.
Supervisor Marshall, I'll second the motion.
Supervisor Marshall with a second. Okay, there's a motion made that we direct administration to get an appraisal and pursue discussions with the city of Wausau once those appraisals are received. Any further discussion? Any further discussion? Okay, seeing none, we'll proceed to vote. All those in favor of the motion to authorize the administrator to get appraisals on those two parking lot properties and further discussions once those appraisals are received from and discussed with the city of Wausau. All those in favor of that motion signify by saying aye. Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion's carried. Thank you. We'll move on to item 6A4, discussion of guidance to staff to develop a recommendation relative to establishing salaries for constitutional officers for the 25-28 term. And I turn it over to our HR director and or administrator, HR director Molly Adzik or Administrator Leonard.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll kick it off, and then Molly will answer any questions that are beyond my knowledge, which are, again, a low threshold. Molly's memo pretty much lays it out. Essentially, the process that you have to undertake in terms of setting those salaries for elected officials, you did it about 2 years ago with respect to the sheriff's office and clerk of court. This year, under statute, it is the county treasurer, county clerk, and register of deeds based on their electoral terms. Really, the question before you, I think, will help us get the information you want to form your ultimate decision. Won't belabor the point, but Molly's memo lays it out very nicely. There's the, do you comp the positions based on comparable other counties? And there's some couple of bullet points underneath that. And then there's the other approach, which is the internal pay structure. That is, you comp it to other positions within our organization. And as Molly states in the memo, really with the sheriff's office and clerk of court position, recently we did that in the midst of our overall compensation study. So for that purpose, we did have kind of some exterior outside county comparables. And then as the memo also lays out, historically, our process had been to comp those elected positions to the existing pay plan. So really seeking some direction from you as a body on what those next steps look like as we develop that recommendation. I don't know, Molly, if there's anything you want to add. Certainly will answer any questions.
Questions by the committee? Supervisor Hart, please.
So,
Thank you. I wanted to ask, in this study, were there any comparisons with not only these positions in other counties, but similar positions in municipalities in this area? Treasurers in the cities, treasurers in the villages, anything like that?
Well, I don't know. So historically, like when we set for the sheriff and the clerk of court, when we went out to just other counties in Wisconsin. Where were they comping those positions? But as far as compensation studies within our range, like when McGrath did our last salary structure, they did not account for elected officials. That would be something that if we were given the direction to do that, we would get those comparables and we would put it on our classification and compensation structure that we currently have. So we certainly could get direction as to what comparables would go into that.
And I guess going back to the 2016, and that's where that chart is in the memo, I can't recall if, as part of that chart, if we went out and had any consideration of external. My assumption would be no, because, again, that was really comped to internal within our organization. So internally, is it, how do we make sure that there's hierarchy within individual departments, but also with each of those positions, are they comped or compared to similar type positions within the county? So I don't know that we went out to municipal treasurers, but I think Milena might have for this.
Yeah, well, when the current, you see those D61, C44, C43, that was a compensation and classification study done several years ago, I believe by Fox Lawson. And so we could go back to see what comparables they used. I'm sure they did use externals beyond, I'm sure there's a whole list of comps that they used. I don't know those off the top of my head, but we would certainly have records somewhere of what they used to come up with those at that time. The same would be true of any comps that McGrath would use to put the positions on our current compensation structure.
Supervisor Robinson?
Molly, so a question for you. I've looked at what some other counties have done, and they've done a combination looking at where comparable counties, and they've also looked at internal classification. If we go with internal classification, the ability of a clerk to move from one county to elected clerk to move from one county to another is limited because they're constitutional officers. But the ability of the deputies in those positions is a real potential for them to move to others. If we look at comparables and fitting into the comp, do you feel like we catch the value of those if we're looking at the deputies and making sure that we've got significant or sufficient separation between the deputy position and the elected official?
Molly, please.
Relative to responsibilities, so the elected official would be paid more in proportionate to where their deputies are?
Absolutely. That would be probably one advantage of looking internally. We would look at all the jobs within the county, like positions, either, the deputies kind of moving into that role or other like department heads. We would fit that classification into our structure, into our organization. Whereas if we were to comp against what other counties are doing specifically for those elected positions, it might not account for upward mobility of other individuals that are currently within our comp structure. So I would say yes, if we were to comp comparables within our organization, we would account for the deputies and the department head counterparts for these elected positions, whereas if we were to go externally to comp with what other counties are doing, we would not.
Wasn't that one of the problems that we had when we had a little bit of a compression issue within like the sheriff's office? Because the sheriff was in some of the people that were under the sheriff were getting close, or in fact, in some cases, were actually being paid more than the sheriff. Okay, all right. Other discussion? Supervisor Hart, please.
Thank you. And this is just kind of a wrap up to this, and it is kind of in relation to the sheriff, where I was made aware recently that the police chief for the city of Wausau gets paid more than the sheriff. And so I'm viewing this as from a competitive angle, where with these positions, they're elected, so they're limited to, they can't obviously just move to a different county. So they're not really comparing these positions with those other counties, but comparing those positions with other jobs that they can take within our community. And I just want to make sure that we're on par with that, because, that if a clerk, for example, if you are a municipal clerk, oftentimes that's an appointed position. So it's, we want to make sure that we have a salary that's comparable, because it's a position that you don't have to campaign for necessarily. So that's something that I want to keep in mind with all of these positions, that we're not just competing with other counties, we're really competing within ourselves for comparable positions here.
Yeah, absolutely. When I put this memo together, again, there was kind of two schools of thought that came to mind as to how we could approach this, but certainly open to direction of the committee to any alternative model for coming up with a formalized recommendation. So certainly any comparables that you would see fit would be on the table. So.
Other discussions?
Mr. Chair, if I can just make one thing clear. So the numbers that you'll see in here, you'll see the chart is from 2016. I just want to, and this is alluded to in the memo. In 2020, when this was last, the salaries for this group of elected officials were last before the board in terms of process. There was no action taken to adopt the resolution that was proposed. So by state law, what that means is you go back to the last resolution that was approved, which is 2016. So just to ready everyone for the resolution that will ultimately come before you with whatever, based on whatever guidance you do give in terms of methodology, there is a fair number of years where we will need to kind of account for the things that have moved. So if the direction is whether to go external or as kind of the primary basis with some additional feedback, or if it's to comp internally with that additional feedback you referenced, Supervisor Hart, to make sure that there is kind of a local touch base. I just want to be very clear. This group of elected officials hasn't seen an increase throughout their entire terms, which I'll be very clear. We're going to bring a recommendation to you that will have, unless you direct us otherwise, it's going to have growth within the term, that 4-year term. There will be a salary increase in each of those years, absent some direction to the contrary. But I think that makes logical sense. People are growing in their position. Even if you're a new individual in any one of those, you might come in with a very baseline part of knowledge, but you're going to grow through that 4-year term. So just wanted to be clear, that's what that 2016 reference was.
But I think it was the HR Finance Committee made a recommendation, and the full board chose not to approve that recommendation, and that's what reverted back to the 2016 salary level set. Okay. Other discussion?
I would just like to pick up on Mr. Chair, I would like to pick up on the discussion relative to where we were in 2016 with the Fox Lawton study. It would be interesting to look at what they used in terms of methodology, because McGrath didn't look at it in the most recent one. But if there were externals that were used, and I just would be interested in seeing what those are. One of the problems that I have is that there's no provision, unlike other county employees, for us to do merit increases. And so all of the elected constitutional officers are sort of treated alike, and you set the salary, and there's no ability to reward for performance, which I think is unfortunate, because I think that there are some that just go out and do an exceptional job, and we're not able to capture that effort or reward that effort. And so I'd like to see sort of a blended one, but look back to the Fox Lawton, is to the comparables, look at where we are, and I want to also make sure that we're being aware of where the departments are relative to comparables, as Supervisor Hart referenced, between the cities and counties and others where the deputies can move, and we want to make sure that we don't compress the pay scale at the expense of the elected officials.
Other discussion? Other discussion? Well, the one thing that I clearly want to, make sure that we do is, we don't want to also set up a scenario, and I think you were alluding to it, Supervisor Robinson, is a scenario where we don't have the appropriate level for those elected positions where people that are underneath them get pushed to a number higher than them. That's one of the, so I think that lends itself towards the internal with some external, potential external comparisons, but leading it towards more internal is what I think I'm hearing from everybody. I don't know that I'm hearing different, but please let me know if you're saying something different from the committee. Other discussion? Administrator Leonard, please.
I just wanted to ask the same question you did, Mr. Chair. Is the desire to, well, piggyback on the term that was used, a blended approach, kind of beginning with that internal comp and then look to see what other positions perhaps locally, to your point? I want to make sure we're getting the right direction. Otherwise, I can guarantee we're going to bring back something you don't want, or information that's not helpful. But start with that internal comp, and we can reach out to the consultant we utilized to help us with that, and then also kind of blend it with comparable roles in other local governments to make sure that we get at that idea that there are kind of those hierarchies within local government and people may move.
I think one of the other things that I would like to see, at least in that, and maybe it's not something that needs to be set up until we actually pass a resolution, but I think Administrator Leonard, you had alluded to it, is that idea that the elected official will receive, if we provide a 3% overall compensation increase for all other staff, that those elected officials would also receive that 3% in subsequent years of their term?
Well, we would need to establish upfront what those percentage increases or lump sum equivalents
Right.
would be when the salaries are established, opposed to historically we had that they would receive a lump sum equivalent to what the board passed for that compensation increase for the rest of staff. But that being ambiguous and undetermined prior to them taking out papers for office as the statute requires, it was determined that was an inappropriate way of doing things. And so moving forward, if we are going to establish a year-over-year increase, we would need to determine what specifically that increase would be for each year of the term. And so we did do that in establishing the salaries for the sheriff and the clerk of court. We set a set percentage, and so each year of the term we have clear total annual salary for each year of that term. So we would want to do the same here.
Okay. All right. Other questions?
Lance seems to disagree.
Supervisor Marshall, I just have a question.
Just a second. Administrator Leonard?
I don't know that I would disagree. Molly's absolutely right. Our historical process had some language that said you get something equal to the lump sum that was allocated. Yeah, a lump sum equivalent to the percentage allocated countywide for all staff. And there is debate. I mean, this just was a topic.
Still does it that way.
Yeah, Wood County does it that way, and there are a couple. It's a matter of debate. I would say Molly's 100% right. The general consensus is best practice is to set those percentages, and I think we can. my general approach is pick the area where there's the least controversy, and it's a lot cleaner to just put in what your best estimates are to what the appropriate increase is going to be. That said, as was alluded to, there are a couple counties that do it the other way. If you ultimately choose to, say, include that language again, I don't know, Mike is on the call as well, I think. He's still there. I don't know, Mike, if you have a different approach, but I know there are a couple counties that do the lump sum equivalent to what was approved by the board in the annual budget process.
Mike, you want to
I am still on.
go ahead, please?
Yeah, we've had a debate amongst corp councils regarding the same issue. I'm leaning on the side of, as Molly indicated, I think there are some concerns with the ability to do the lump sum equivalent without specifically establishing what that amount is prior to papers being taken out. So my preference from a legal standpoint is that we don't look to pursue that direction. But if the board wanted to look that way, I would do some additional research to give a formal opinion about whether we thought that was legally doable.
Thank you.
Mr. Chair.
Supervisor Marshall was next, I think. Supervisor Marshall?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just had, I know the administrator had said we could reach out to our consultant to gather that salary information, but that salary information is public record. So I'm just wondering if that's something that staff could do, since it's only really 3 positions, and the data should be readily available.
We certainly can get the salary information. My suggestion, and I apologize if I was inartful in the terminology, was to have them essentially do the determination of where it should fall on the compensation schedule. I mean, staff will do that. Molly and her team can do that as well, but it's fairly standard practice for us to just at least run our initial thoughts by our consultant to make sure we're not off base. It's just a second set of eyes. But you're absolutely right. I mean, our pay plan is published on the website, so we certainly there's no lack of transparency relative to what the existing scale is.
Okay, Supervisor Robinson?
Nor what other counties offer for their services. So I guess I was just wondering what value add a consultant gives when I guess I feel our staff would be competent in providing that recommendation.
Yeah, I would agree that I would feel confident putting together a recommendation. What the consultant would do that I wouldn't be able to do in just looking at comparable salaries is actually running it through the methodology of, based on the actual duties of the job, what's the exposure, what's the knowledge and skill necessary, what is the risk associated, there are several different points in a job description or a job I guess a job description is what I'll say, that essentially gain like a ranking system that would put it into our classification and compensation schedule. So opposed to others pay this much, we should pay this much, it's actually looking at the duties of the job, what's necessary to carry out those duties, what level of risk, what level of exposure is associated with the individual doing that job. So it's just a multi-factor kind of investigation into the job, opposed to just salary based, because not all jobs with the same job title are actually the same job in terms of the duties that are necessary to execute that job within a different county or a different organization. So I apologize for the kind of inarticulate explanation of that, but there is some added value in what the consultant would do versus what I could do in terms of just what's publicly available and the time it would take to sift through and sort through all the different job descriptions and the nature of the job as it changes from county to county or municipality to municipality.
I think the one thing that's clear, I mean, I think there, even though we call them both clerks, the city clerk versus the county clerk, I think the job responsibilities are different. And so I think what, if I'm hearing you correctly, Molly, what the consultant does is brings those two then and understands the distinct differences that they may have and ranks them. Okay. Supervisor Robinson?
Well, I would just like to go back to the issue of lump sum versus a percentage. If you look at what we did for ourselves, we went with the percentage increase. I don't like the lump sum approach. I would prefer that we go with a established percent increase during the term of office.
Okay. The only thing that I'll push back on that a little bit, John, and that is it moves the base each year, and then those positions are held for election. And so the candidate or the individual that wins the election may be coming back and starting. So I think the recognition is the increase is for years in service, and there might not be a move of the range of the position if it's reset on the following year. I think there needs to be a reset, but it may not be at the beginning level of experience that you're looking at potentially for the next term. Does that make any sense?
But you can do that with a percentage, establishing a percentage, and then in 4 years from now, when we're evaluating these positions, we look at the same comparables and go through the same process, but we then have a mechanism by which we can adjust it internally during that period of office. Okay. And again, we did it for ourselves as county supervisors with I believe, a 3% increase every year.
Right. Okay. Other discussion? So I'm going to look to the administrator and to the HR director if they've got enough direction to get information back to this committee for a recommendation, because again, this committee needs to take action and the board needs to take action at its March meeting to set those salaries prior to the April 15th date of when those elected potential candidates can take out paperwork by state statute.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is the joy of virtual meetings. There were heads nodding in the room when I asked the question, and I kind of reflected back what I think some of the comments alluded to, and I guess I'm just going to ask if please take yourself off mute and offer a pushback on this explanation of what I kind of understand the discussion to have been, for those of you that are virtual for sure. That we try to get at a blended approach whereby we start with the internal comparable approach where we utilize our existing pay plan and the job descriptions for the 3 elected offices to ensure that there is internal consistency and fairness in terms of how those positions are placed within our existing pay plan. But then also, as was alluded to, and kind of getting to that blended piece, reach out and look for local comparable positions in terms of scope and authority to ensure that we're locally also in a good place. And then the last piece was to adopt a recommendation that does call for a clear percentage increases over that 4-year term, with the understanding that then again in 4 years you would undertake a similar approach. So if any part of that is inconsistent with what this committee or any individual member is kind of looking for, please let us know.
So I guess I would entertain any feedback from any of the committee members if there's anything that was inconsistent with what the administrator just laid out. Okay. Seeing none, we will then assume that everybody has at least agreed in tentative approach and we will be seeing this back on the committee agenda for the next meeting. Next is items to be discussed and possible action by the HR Finance Committee forward to the county board. Opportunity to provide recommendations relative to items included in the administrator's 2024 work plan. Administrator Leonard, please.
I don't have anything to add. You actually have had this conversation a couple of times at this committee. At the last executive committee meeting, there was discussion that executive is going to rank those items to provide some direction to myself and staff in terms of how to prioritize our work. If there are any, I think Chair Robinson just wanted to make sure that there was again an opportunity to provide that input. If anything, if anyone had any new items that this wasn't considered, I certainly will note that on the bottom of the draft and have it so that the full board can potentially reprioritize whatever comes to it from executive.
And I just remind the executive committee members that I've received several of those rankings, and I've not received them all. So I will be getting an email out to those individuals that need to fill out that ranking yet and bring it back so we can have that discussion at exec. And we'll move from exec. It'll be moved to the full board for its consideration. Any discussion on that item, the opportunity recommendations on the administrator's 2024 work plan by the committee? All right. Next meeting is scheduled for Wednesday, March 13th, 2024 at 3 p.m. And committee members are asked to bring future items for discussion. Anything else? We are down to item number 9. What is your pleasure? Motion by Supervisor Hart to adjourn. Is there a second?
Second.
Merkin, second.
Seconded. Any discussion? All those in favor of adjournment signify by saying aye. Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? We stand adjourned. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.